Hello and welcome to the 43rd episode of When Life Hands You Linens. This is the first episode of the new decade, 2020, and I am so excited for what I have in store for the podcast this year, including the guests and some ideas that I have for the show. So stick around for those. But this week's guest is Mr. Ben Mendoza. He is a 2018 inductee to the IMD Hall of Fame and also the 2016 Telecom Management Industry Champion Award. He is the co-founder and president of Beatchain, which is a powerful new data-driven platform for musicians, labels, managers, and promoters that really dig in and help them find their information as well as find their audience. Now, in this episode, Ben and I talk about all kinds of good stuff, including big data. Ben really breaks down what big data is and how it's kind of been exclusive to major labels and people with bigger budgets, but now it's becoming more and more independent, I guess you could say, and more profound and easier to access by independent musicians. And he talks about how we can use this data to really find our audience and find your fans. He also talks about machine learning and how it's implemented within our society. He talks about artificial intelligence, and he shares all kinds of cool things that Beatchain can do and what big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence can do, and all kinds of fun stuff. Before we dive in, I want to remind you to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform that you listen to your podcasts on. I also want to remind you to sign up to the mailing list, as well as follow me on social medias, which everything will be in the show notes below. And if you or somebody you know would be a good guest for the show, there's also a link to a Google form, which will get sent to me, and I will dig into it a little bit more and reach out if you are a good guest or somebody you refer would be a good guest for the show. So, without further ado, let's get to the conversation with Mr. Ben Mendoza. You're listening to the When Life Hands You Linens podcast.
But in an entry-level film production, it's one strike and you're out. You're fired. I'm not calling you back.
If your goal today is to make a basket, we're going to make that basket.
The minute you create something, as soon as it's made tangible, you have a copyright in it.
How do I get our guys to sound that big, that full when they do the harmonies?
And I'm your host, Lennon Seahawk. Let's get to the show.
Yeah, well, thanks, Lennon, very much for having me on. So I suppose you would call me a tech entrepreneur. That's what we've been sort of referred to as, because I've run a number of companies and, over the last 30 years, but they've been predominantly in the sort of high-tech space. So very much sort of development focused. I started a company back in 95, which basically looked after very large financial institutions, but later on in its career, we ended up with companies like Apple and Facebook as our customers. So, we are used to writing very, if you like, industrial strength products from a development point of view that work with enormous amounts of data. But I've also always been a great sort of fan of music and a musician of sorts. In fact, much to the horror of my parents, I left school at 16 to play in a rock band. And although I didn't actually become really a professional musician, I've met a lot of professional musicians over the years. And what sort of brought about the Beatchain was the opportunity for me to look to do something else in the sort of music tech space as I was sort of stepping down from the last company. And I came across a band on YouTube. This must have been, it must be 3 or 4 years ago now. A band called Brother Strut. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. but they're a fantastic sort of funk and soul band, and they were put together by this guy called Steve Jones, who lived relatively locally to me. Is about an hour away from where I lived, as it turns out. And Steve is a professional musician, great producer and saxophonist, or plays all sorts of instruments actually, and he has lived through what I sort of tend to refer to as music industry 1.0, and has had record deals and so had all his sort of compatriots, and had sort of been dropped from record labels as well because somebody just decided one day to flick a switch and they were changing direction or whatever, and so had become sort of somewhat disillusioned with the old models, and decided that he would, when he put Brother Strutt together, he was going to do this completely independently. And so he's a bright guy and learned about direct marketing and so on, and got into the sort of Facebook ads, and which was very early on in Facebook's ads really, but became very good at it and was very successful, and that's really the reason I think why I came across them, and they were in my stream. I was seeing information about things that I liked. One of the things that they decided they would do would be some crowdfunding to try and raise some money to put together their second album. And one of the things they were offering was, we'll come and play at your event for X amount of dollars or whatever it was, or pounds in fact, because this was in the UK. And so I said, okay, I'm up for that. It was coming up to a Christmas party for us, and I said, well, what better than have this great band come down and play for us? So I responded, and we set it all up, and they came down, and we had a great evening with them. And after that, after the party was over, Steve and I sat down, and we started talking about how he'd put all this stuff together. And it was fascinating. It was fascinating to me because as he was talking about what he was doing from a putting together content, lo-fi content as well as really hi-fi content. We'll sort of come back to that in a minute. And placing these ads and learning about Facebook's ad manager and everything else. And this was really early days for Instagram as well. It was really before Instagram was the main platform for music. I could see that if you apply the tech from the right angle, we could make something that was scalable and that would be usable by any sorts of bands and musicians anywhere, not just for them. So this was a sort of an idea sort of growing in the back of my mind, and Steve was raising money, and he was talking to me about would I be interested in helping fund some other activities, and he'd been to see a few people in the music industry, but he actually said to me, look, I don't want to take investment from a label or somebody in the music industry. I want to do this independently, and I know about sort of big data and the way in which you can develop good products and good platforms to make life a bit more easy for the artist, and he knows about the music industry. So we said, well, let's get together and work on a plan, and that was really sort of the birth of Beatchain. So we started to work together. I started to put a little team of developers together to look at all the different things that we would need to do. And I started to learn more about the music industry because, to be honest, I didn't know that much about it myself. I'm more on the technical side. And I have also got obviously a number of connections in the music world from my old days, and I called some of those guys up, and they were very good and put me in touch with some very interesting people in the industry who I was able to sit down with and have further conversations. And what became sort of clearer and clearer to me was Yeah, and I don't mean to sound at all sort of judgmental or insulting to the industry, but it seems to be there's a lot of opportunity to improve things. Let's put it that way, in terms of the way in which data is just not shared between the different components in the industry. So labels aren't sharing their data with promoters, and promoters aren't getting information from the ticket sellers like Live Nation and so on. Yet all this data should be joined together, because it's part of a journey that you're going through as an artist. If you want to produce your content or put on a show, sell tickets and so on, you need to have all these data points being able to be connected together so that you can actually look at that data and then use some tech behind the scenes, which the artist doesn't really need to know anything about, but to derive particular insights from that data that will help you take the next steps in your career. So this is what we decided to do. We would put together a set of tools, if you like, on a sort of a clever platform, which is the Beatchain platform, which allowed us to provide a number of different functions. So simply by putting in information about your band's name, we've written code that goes out there and organizes the internet for you effectively, and comes back with an incredible amount of data about you that you probably didn't know was even out there. And it brings it all together into what we call an insights dashboard that shows you exactly who your fans are, which playlists you're on, which posts that you've made are performing the best, understanding your sort of demographics in terms of a number of different data points, obviously things like gender, but age group and where they are as well. And when people first see this, I mean, we've had quite a lot of people use the system now. For many of them, it's a bit of a revelation. They just didn't realise this is where all the people that like their music actually were, and who they were, and the other affinities that they might have. And that's really interesting data that you can really use to your advantage to sort of promote yourself, put your brand out there, and take the next steps in your career. Any questions for me at this point?
Yeah, that was a lot of information, and so thank you for sharing that. You tossed around the term big data, and I hear that term quite often, and I'm starting to hear it a little more in the music industry. I know it's huge in like the tech world, computer science and stuff, but can you kind of elaborate on what big data is and how it can be kind of revolutionary and really amplify a musician or a band's career?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's not that mystical, big data. It's just a lot of data, but there are many, there are many components within the world of in the music industry that generate very big data. Streaming is obviously the most obvious. If you think about how many streams, if you take a big artist, and we've worked with quite a few big artists now in terms of the beta testing of the Beatchain platform, we have some artists that are producing 3 million rows of data a day. In terms of the streams that they're producing on a number of different platforms, and when you start to, so that, if you like, that's big data. You're getting into many millions, possibly billions of rows over months. What you need to do is to be able to organise that information and drill into it and know what you're looking for in terms of producing some actionable insights. So, for example, one of the band's data that we looked at was actually Motley Crue, because we've been working with what's now Better Noise Music in New York, run by Alan Kovac. And, in terms, he's been incredibly helpful to us in terms of giving us ideas and helping us, with the sort of beta test phase of the platform. And they gave us, access to Motley Crue's data as test data for us to look at. And they've had quite a resurgence recently because of the Netflix movie The Dirt and also the upcoming musical that's going to go out there about the sort of opiates crisis, which is called The Heroin Diaries, based on Nikki Sixx's book. And anyway, back to the data. It's incredibly rich. There's so many data points that you get when you look at streaming data. So you know exactly who streamed it on what device, what time of day it was. You know whether they were leaning back or leaning in, meaning were they actually looking for that track, or was it something that just appeared on a playlist they happened to be listening to? Where did they skip? And that again is an incredible piece of information in terms of its value, because if you were saying we're now going to promote a tour or we're going to put some sort of advertising out there, we'd like to know what's the most engaging part of a track. We don't want to put the bit out there that everybody skips away from. We want to use that 20 seconds, which most people were leaning in on. So being able to get that sort of data together and interpret it in that way is incredibly useful. So big data is just those areas where you're getting an enormous amount of information. So it will be all the comments and information that come out of posts. It'll be mostly to do with streaming, though. I think that's where the biggest volumes are going to come that we've seen so far.
Excellent. That's good information. So do you think that big data do you think it's been more exclusive to people like bigger labels and companies like Spotify and Apple and Google? And do you think that big data is kind of trickling down and kind of coming to more kind of independent musicians like me, like yourself, and a lot of probably the other musicians that you work with? And how can these independent musicians kind of utilize this data further and potentially educate themselves on how to use it?
Well, this is really the idea of Beatchain. The idea of Beatchain is to use some really clever tech in the background so that the artist doesn't need to, effectively. So to do all these things without you having to become an expert on big data. We will take all that information from all your streams, from all your ticket sales, from everything else that we need to do. We'll put it all together and join it in the right way so that we can reveal to you really interesting and actionable insights. So I think it's just a fact of life that big data exists in the music world. It's not something that we suddenly expect all the artists out there to become Python developers. That's sort of unrealistic. So what we want to do is really put together a set of tools that's just really easy to use, really affordable as well. I think that's really important. I was really dismayed when I met some of these fantastic musicians. The fact that they're so brilliant, it just knocked me out. Yet they're having to work in the evening, in a restaurant or in a pub to make ends meet, because they don't make a living out of what they love. And what we're trying to do now is really put together a set of tools that anybody can use, whether you're a DJ, a bedroom artist. It doesn't really matter what genre you're in. You can use these tools to learn how to make yourself sort of a bigger footprint out there, to take the appropriate steps to go forward. And I completely understand that most people think that getting on a playlist and streaming revenue is the answer. But actually, for the experience I've had for the last few years looking at it is, streaming revenues tends to represent about 20% of an artist's revenue. The other 80% will come from other things, and mostly that's live performance, ticket sales, and so on. Obviously, there are areas where if you're just into sync licensing and that sort of thing, then that's different. But for most performing musicians, they will make more out of live performance than they will from streaming in most cases. And what that means, if you sort of follow the sort of logic trail here, if you want to do live performance, then you need to be able to sell tickets. And you're going to be able to sell tickets if you have fans that love what you do. So it comes back to broadcasting what you're doing out there to the right people, understanding who they are, and sort of hyper-targeting those people that our data tells us are the right people to buy your tickets in a particular area.
I'm thinking of all this stuff and all the musicians out there, and I'm seeing, I follow a lot of the music that I listen to are independent artists, and they're maybe signed to an independent label. And I'm thinking of all the opportunities and all the social media and all the stuff that they're doing to continually promote themselves, whether it be creating tutorials on YouTube on how they're doing their production, or, background content on their tours, and, they're touring accessibly and pushing out so much music, and that might not be necessary. I'm reading in your biography here that was filled out on a form here. The music industry generates $50 billion in sales. That's a lot of money. And only a small percentage of that ends up going to artists. Can you talk a little bit about what percentage and what is the bigger percentage that's going to artists, and what are some of the common revenue streams that you're seeing a lot of artists kind of miss out on that can be very lucrative?
Yeah, well, it's if you think about it in the old days, well, it's probably still the current situation in some ways. But if you get signed to a label, it doesn't necessarily mean to say you're going to be massively successful. They do tend to have the 80-20 rule. Sort of 20% of them are well looked after, and the other 80% is sort of a long tail of other artists that are on the label. And it used to be even worse than that. You used to sort of just have superstars at one end and sort of starving musicians at the other. And it depends a lot on the structure of the deals that are signed, and how much of any advance that is then recoupable as you sort of work through your agreement with the labels and so on, and so these days you don't need to do that anymore. I mean, the main advantages of obviously being signed to a label is the fact that there is a lot of music expertise within those companies, and they have great production and studio capabilities and so on, which was sort of, I think, more important a few years ago than it is today. And of course, they had promotion budgets and marketing that they would spend on you. But these days, we have shown very clearly through the Beatchain platform that with the social media platforms that you can use yourself directly without having any sort of deal with a label, are just as effective. In fact, in many cases, more effective, because you're in complete control of it. And in fact, we found that some of the material that the independent artists are sort of naturally producing, which I would call sort of more lo-fi. In other words, this is us setting up the gear. We recorded this on our iPhone. This is us doing our sound check. We can do that over Facebook Live or something. That's much more engaging than the sort of pre-packaged marketing that comes out of many of the labels. So that having that sort of relationship with your fan where they feel you're talking to them sort of one-to-one is a really important aspect of what you can set up on the Beatchain platform. So that I think has proved itself to be true in many of the cases that we've run through the Beatchain platform so far.
Excellent. I want to transition to artificial intelligence, because I was reading your bio and you have some experience with artificial intelligence. And as a journalist, I've done a few articles on artificial intelligence, and I'm seeing it a lot more frequently, I guess you could say, in the news, whether it be with computer software. It's being implemented in vehicles. It's being implemented in basically everything, everyday life, and we may not even know it and realize it. And, I've listened to podcasts where, entrepreneurs, tech entrepreneurs have kind of warned us that it could potentially take over pretty mindless jobs. So can you explain like what artificial intelligence is and maybe how you think it's going to affect the music industry and how it can maybe be beneficial and unbeneficial?
Yeah, absolutely. Artificial intelligence is one of those terms that's bandied about all over the place. It's a very, very large subject and has loads of sort of subcomponents to it too. So, we only use a very small sort of subsection of artificial intelligence, and that includes some areas which would be referred to as machine learning, which is where you have basically rule sets that you train. So you can train a rule set to recognize certain elements of data and take certain actions. And it can become sort of more efficient itself at doing that rather than somebody having to reprogram anything. It just sort of learns from the training data that you give it. So how are we going to apply some of that within Beatchain is, for example, when you're sort of using you're buying something from Amazon and it makes suggestions for you. So, people that like this sort of product, and it's the same on Spotify. You like this sort of music, therefore we think you're going to like these other things too. Okay, we can use those sorts of techniques to build lookalike fan bases for you and target them, especially when we get into placing adverts, or you're putting your blog posts out there and targeting who those audiences are going to be. We can use points in the data to learn who has responded the most, who has come back the most times to visit a particular post or a landing page and so on, and tune the next post that we put out and target the next audience sort of automatically in the background for you. So we can use affinity data as well. So we might find that we had this with a particular beatbox group that we did a lot of work with in the UK. We found that the demographic for those guys tended to be sort of males aged between 18 and 35. But one of the other affinities we found is that they like modding cars, and they drank particular brands of beer. And so, using that sort of data and putting things together, we can send your information and content that you've produced to an audience you wouldn't necessarily have thought of, by saying, okay, let's go to the people that like modding cars and drinking this sort of beer. They might never have heard of you before, but it just turns out that the data doesn't lie. The data says these types of people like this sort of music, or that's what we found the other way around. And it was amazing to see that information come to life when we went to the gigs that these people were putting on. Lo and behold, these people all turned up in their modded cars, with all the lights underneath and all this other stuff. And it was really interesting to see that. So it's sort of cleverly using the data and making suggestions as to where you should step next in terms of, you know, how to best use the dollars you have to, especially if you're using Facebook ads and paying for advertising. Another sort of thing that we can do which is coming in our sort of Premium Plus, sort of super premium version, which is coming out later in the year, is automatically generate these ad sets, which would be impossible for a human to look after, because you would spend 24 hours a day sort of nursing it and nurturing it to turn off the adverts that weren't getting traction and move the budget to the ones that were getting traction. But those are the sorts of things that, you know, computers can do really well. So if you've got the right approach and the right machine learning and the right algorithms in the background, you know, we can really say, we'll start off with 100 different ad sets, but automatically over the next couple of days, that budget will get concentrated just down to those adverts that are producing the most engagement. So you're getting the biggest bang for your buck.
That's alone is a pretty powerful feature, because I've kind of been delving into Facebook ads and have been not dabbling in it, but I've been watching a lot of people use the platform, and they're always toggling on and off. Like, is this ad working? No, not really. This one's doing really well. Let's push this one a little bit harder. Let's spend more money on this. You know, it's got a low cost per click, and cost per whatever it may be. So
that takes me back to the original conversations I had with Steve when we were first talking about doing this. Was, you know, he was saying the problem that he was having, he wasn't having any time to be creative and actually do the music part. He was spending all his time all day looking at these adverts, and he was trying to sort of becoming an IT person. So what we've tried to do within the software and the clever stuff that we're doing in the background is to sort of automate as much of that as we can and put rules behind it, which, you know, as far as the front end is concerned and the artist or user is concerned, you know, it's sort of wizard driven. So, you know, what do you want to do next? And then you make your choices as you go through the sort of the wizard and press go, and away it goes and takes care of it. So which audience are you, which geography are you focusing on, down to cities and so on, and that is all obviously being fed from the data that we've generated in the insights that we've gathered about you, and then. How much do you want to spend? What's your budget on advertising? It may only be $10 a day. Musicians don't have a fortune to spend on these things. So we really need to optimize the way in which we, use that and generate the most interest we can for you.
That's really powerful too, because like you said, especially independent musicians, they do not have a lot of money to spend towards like advertising, and not only that, spending money, but also spending time. Time for an independent musician is completely invaluable. So that's really cool and very powerful.
So I was going to say, so what we've done, just to paint a little bit more of a picture of, because I know you wanted to talk about AI and you wanted to talk about the tech, but for the artists listening that aren't necessarily interested in the bits and bytes, if you like, I think it's important to understand what the scope of the platform is. So as well as having the insights dashboard that shows you literally a map of where everybody is and who's interacting, with your posts and so on, or which posts are doing the best, we also compare you with all the other artists that are like you, of the same size, in your genre. So you can see from what they're doing, what posts are working, and learn from them as well, and say, maybe we should be doing some of that. We also have a media library which allows you to upload and store and organize all your content for posting to those social channels, and it tells you which ones you've used. So you're not going to post the same thing again necessarily, and it starts to look like you're not caring about what you're putting out there. And it has a scheduler, so you can say, okay, over the coming weeks, these are the posts. I've got them all lined up. I'm going to send this one out today, and then on Wednesday we're doing this one. On Friday we're doing that one. It may be a piece of video. It may be some photographs and some music files and other things. So what's coming in again later in the year is what we call Campaign Manager. So now we're putting together best practices for people to say, okay, if you're launching an EP, this is the sort of content that you want to put out, and you can sort of drag and drop it into the slots, and it'll automatically set it up for you and run that campaign. Or if you're going on tour and you need to sell tickets, it'll allow you to put a campaign together to do that as well. So again, more automation around saving people time, keeping all their media in one place, and understanding exactly where it's going out. I don't know if you've ever used Hootsuite.
Yep, I do. I actually use Buffer, but yeah.
Okay, Buffer's a similar thing. So this is, we've taken the sort of the best ideas from those things and put it together in the Launchpad there. So you have Media Library, Launchpad. We also have sort of electronic press kit, EPKs. So this is like a slick pre-release preview of your tracks to share with, bloggers and playlisters and anyone else who needs to hear it. Maybe before it's going to be, properly released on the DSPs. We have distribution. So we signed a deal with Fuga, and so we are including distribution and we've written a front end to really make it nice and slick and easy and as painless as possible to distribute music to all the major DSPs. And of course, these are all linked. All these components are all linked together. Now, you don't have to use all of them. As a musician, if you've already got DistroKid or you're already using Buffer or something else, then fine. Carry on doing that. We don't mind, but we don't know what you're going to have. So we have to put all the pieces together for, if you were starting out and you didn't know what you needed, you've got all these pieces in the product that you can use. So we've also got an absolutely amazing website builder. Has to be seen to be believed in terms of it's like a zero-click website builder because it knows all about you from the internet. It will go and get your information and put you together an incredible website in literally a few seconds with a shop and everything else you need as a starting out musician. It is absolutely amazing. And we also have an email management tool, I suppose a bit like MailChimp, that sort of thing. So you can do all your email campaigns. We have Hyperlink, which is show your fans where to find all your releases on their preferred platforms. And get in-depth analysis of your fans' streaming activity. So all these components are all part of the Beatchain platform. They all use the sort of underlying tech that we built. And this is what I was talking about earlier on when I was saying the data from the different areas needs to be joined together so you get that overall picture. And that's what's been missing, I believe, in the industry. And I think when people see what Beatchain brings, they're amazed how easy it becomes, or how much easier it becomes. I mean, being a musician isn't easy. We can't make you good as a musician, but we can certainly help you have the best chance of building your brand and getting a really engaged fan base, not just likes where it's easy to click a like, but actually measuring who's engaging and nurturing them into sort of super fans that want to buy your merchandise and want to buy your tickets and want to turn up at your shows.
I want to go back just a little bit on machine learning, and correct me if I'm wrong, but for those who don't know, Ben gave an excellent description and a good detailed information on what machine learning is, but just kind of putting things into more simpler terms. Machine learning is kind of everywhere. You go on Netflix, you're watching movies, it's constantly recommending movies that you may like based on the ones you've already liked and the ones that you've literally watched and liked. So Hulu does the same thing. YouTube is doing the same thing for potential video suggestions. You may have clicked on a cat video and now it's going to suggest more cat videos, or it's going to suggest dog videos. You click on a dog video and there's, you like the birds and you're interacting with people commenting on the birds. It's probably going to suggest bird videos to you. Facebook is doing the same thing with advertising. You're being targeted with ads based on where you're going on the internet. Google's doing the same thing. So all of this information, everything you're doing, literally everything you do is machine learning. And I'm sure Ben can probably explain a little bit more on that as well. But it's everywhere in life, regardless of whether we accept it or not. It's just how things are going because it's so effective and it's so efficient, and it's how it keeps people engaged, and it's how people get hooked on series on Netflix. They're just constantly being recommended shows that they're going to like, and they click them and they watch them and they get hooked.
Yeah, absolutely. So, machine learning is used absolutely everywhere, as you said, whether it's medical diagnosis or, image recognition or speech recognition. There's enormous amounts of use for it, but it's not been, I don't think it's been used particularly in any products that are aimed at independent musicians before. So, I think from that point of view, we may be one of the first to do it.
Yeah. And I was listening to a podcast, I believe it was a Joe Rogan episode with Andrew Yang, and he was explaining, there was a point in there that was, because you mentioned medical diagnosis, and Andrew was explaining how artificial intelligence and machine learning can basically look at x-rays and diagnose them much, much, much more efficiently, much more accurately, and much quicker than a human would ever be able to do. And that's both scary and both amazing at the same time. Like if a computer can scan thousands or tens of thousands of x-rays in a day and very accurately diagnose somebody, that's incredible.
Well, that's exactly right. And the thing is, the computer doesn't get tired.
Exactly.
There are certain things that humans can do, obviously better than the computers in terms of making lateral thinking, if you like. But what we're telling people, and what I want to happen with the way in which Beatchain works, this is always working for you in the background. It's always looking at your data. It's always trying to come up with a way in which you can improve the way you're presented to your fan base. We want you to go to bed at night and wake up in the morning a little bit more famous than you were.
That's always definitely a goal, and to wake up with 500 more fans or 1,000 more fans than you went to bed with. And I'm sure you're very familiar with Tesla and what they're doing with their vehicles. I'm a huge Tesla fan, and I've talked about that on my podcast before. But I know people that own one, and I've driven one quite a few times, and I tell them about I tell friends and family about autopilot, people who don't know about Teslas and like what it really is. It's an electric vehicle. And I tell them, yeah, the car literally drives itself. It'll take you off on an on-ramp on a highway. It'll navigate around traffic, and it'll take you off-ramp, and eventually it'll be able to navigate you around town, paying attention to stop signs, stoplights, pedestrians, traffic cones, everything like that. I'm like, well, isn't that scary? Like when you're driving on the highway and there's so many people coming in and out. And it is at first, I will admit, but once you get used to it, you start to realize that the computer is always paying attention. It's always, humans are gawking, they're daydreaming, they're listening to music, they're listening to a podcast, they're watching a movie, they're doing their hair, they're reading a book. They get distracted, they get tired. But the computer, like you mentioned, does not get tired. It's always paying attention. And I think that's something that I think as it continually evolves and AI continues to evolve, people are going to become more reliant on it. They're going to realize the power of it, and it's just going to completely automate their entire workflow, so they can focus more so on being creative and playing music.
Well, one question for you, Lennon. You're a musician yourself, yes?
Yes.
So log on to sign up to Beatchain. It doesn't cost anything to sign up. And put in the name of your, you don't have to do this right now, obviously, but put in the name of your band or whatever, and you'll see it for yourself. It's much better to see this with your own eyes than it is. I can never explain it as well as the results that come out. So I think hopefully you'll be able to report back in a future episode that you thought this was worthwhile.
Yeah, I'll definitely check it out and report back. I haven't done a whole lot with my music alias in a while, but I do have some tracks coming out, and I'm working on trying to finish them up. So coming back just a little bit more, and probably the last topic we'll talk about, but I think it's really, really important. You talked about Beatchain and all these other companies such as Netflix and Google and Facebook and Apple and Twitter and everything else kind of collecting this data and being able to serve you good information and relevant topics and movies and tweets and ads and concerts and artists. How, for those kind of worried about privacy, how does one kind of collect all that data and how specific can somebody kind of get with these types of things?
Right. Okay. So it's a very good question. And obviously we need to be compliant with GDPR, which is a European sort of data standards, and the new CCPA standards are coming out in the US as well. But we only really collect publicly available data anyway. Obviously, the information that's coming back from streaming and so on is provided to the artist and is used by that artist to it's collected within the Beatchain data lake and then provided to the artist. So it's not ever provided externally without being aggregated first. So we're never ever going to say, oh, it's Mrs. Smith from 45 Acacia Avenue that listened to this. It'll be that she's one of the many sort of in a female demographic of this age in this city. That's as close as you'll get to that sort of information.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense, because I know a lot of people are probably, they're worried about, privacy, especially with computers. I have a Google Home in my home. So it's like, just those types of things kind of freak people out because they're always listening and they're beeping and they're saying, oh, sorry, I didn't understand that. And it's like, well, I was sleeping. There was nothing to understand. So it's kind of like scary, like what's going on. So having, being online and having, you're visiting all these websites and they're collecting data because that best allows them to serve you content, relevant content that you're going to click on and stay on and share and engage with. But yeah, like you said, it's nice to know that a lot of this data it's publicly available, and it's not like it's not going to get down to like it's Mrs. Smith who's 45 years old with 3 kids who banks at U.S. Bank and has lived at these previous locations. It's not like a complete
No, absolutely
trail.
not. No, it doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be that level of detail. I mean, obviously, when you're selling tickets to people, that's through a different interface anyway, and that's something you as an artist or whatever would do directly through the platform. But it's not data that we're collecting in that way. I mean, we use a lot of, in fact, pretty much all the APIs that are available to us. So, Beatchain's become a Facebook marketing partner and a Instagram marketing partner, which means that we get access to certain APIs that the sort of general public and your musician wouldn't get access to. So we get to more data points than you would do without having the Beatchain platform. But again, that isn't information that is exposed to anybody. It's just used by the aggregation algorithms in the system.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. That's cool as well. So, lastly, do you have any like helpful resources aside from Beatchain where independent musicians specifically, and maybe just musicians in general, can go and learn more about big data or artificial intelligence or machine learning, and then maybe kind of get some ideas and how it can be implemented in their careers?
Well, I mean, there's so many different resources out there. There's plenty of courses and some great, YouTube explainers, if you like, on big data. And I would recommend, anybody just go and browse through the educational content that's already out there. I don't have any particular favorites myself, but I know it's very, very simple to find. I mean, what we are doing, which I think is very important, within the Beatchain company, we're about 30 people now, and which is probably 55-60% technology and 35% sort of music industry professionals. And so those guys are putting together a number of tutorials for independent artists and so on, to say these are the approaches that we find are working best in terms of whether that's creating content or producing adverts and that sort of stuff. So we are going to be producing more educational content on the website, which you'll be able to get to. If people give us feedback that they are interested in how the sort of nuts and bolts work inside the machine, then we'd be delighted to share more details with them. But to be honest with you, I've always thought about this as people know the buzzwords, but don't really necessarily need to know how it all works to get the most out of it. They'd much prefer to be writing their next hit song and planning their next sort of tour.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. Safe travels to New York and safe travels back home, wherever you're going. And good luck with the launch and the continued success of Beatchain.
Landon, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Really enjoyed your podcasts.